Blood trickled down William Jackson's temple as Officer Brennan pressed the elderly man against the patrol car. "Please," William whispered, his weathered hands trembling. Behind them, hidden in the shade of an ancient oak, Police Commissioner Raymond Carter lowered his newspaper, his expression hardening with each passing second. "Before we dive into this powerful story of justice and transformation, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Take a second to hit that like button if you believe in dignity for all people, and subscribe to join our storytelling community. Now let's discover what happens when injustice meets its match." Every Tuesday afternoon, rain or shine, 78-year-old William Jackson followed the same peaceful routine at Oakwood Park. The retired high school principal would arrive precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a small paper bag of breadcrumbs and a weathered copy of Langston Hughes' poems bound in faded blue leather. He always wore the same cardigan, a soft brown one with leather elbow patches that had been his late wife Martha's favorite. "You look distinguished in it," she used to say, straightening his collar with hands that would later wither from cancer. William would make his way to the third bench by the duck pond. Underneath the sprawling branches of an oak tree that had been there longer than he had been alive. The bench afforded the perfect view of the water, the carefully tended flower beds, and the winding path where mothers pushed strollers and joggers huffed past in brightly colored athletic wear. For William, Oakwood Park represented more than just a pleasant spot to spend an afternoon. It was sanctuary and remembrance. A place where time slowed enough for him to hear his own thoughts above the noise of a world that seemed to move faster every year. During his 45 years educating the children of Riverdale, he had brought countless students here for science lessons and poetry readings. He had proposed to Martha on a blanket near the Rose Garden in 1969. Just days before he marched alongside her in a local civil rights demonstration. And 2 years ago, after losing Martha to the cancer that had claimed her so quickly, he had scattered some of her ashes near their favorite bench, against park regulations but with the quiet blessing of the longtime groundskeeper who remembered them both from decades past. The breadcrumbs were for the mallards that gathered expectantly when they spotted his familiar figure approaching. The poetry was for his soul. "I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins," he would sometimes recite quietly, Hughes' words flowing through him like the very rivers they described. Lately, William had noticed subtle changes in the park's atmosphere. Oakwood was situated between two neighborhoods. His predominantly black community of West Side, where he'd lived his entire adult life, and the affluent, mostly white area of Oakwood Heights. In recent months, police presence had increased noticeably in the park. He'd observed more patrol cars circling the perimeter, more uniformed officers strolling the paths. Some longtime parkgoers had begun giving him sidelong glances, as though his presence on his usual bench was somehow suspicious. Just last week, a woman had clutched her purse tighter as she hurried past him. These small indignities weren't unfamiliar to William. He had lived through worse, much worse, in his 78 years. He had been one of the first black students to integrate Riverdale High in the 50s, had faced down fire hoses in the 60s, had pushed for educational equality throughout his career as an educator. He had learned to carry himself with a dignity that created its own gravity, pulling respect toward him even from those initially reluctant to give it. Today, William was particularly looking forward to his afternoon in the park. His grandson Michael had graduated from law school the previous weekend, and they were meeting for dinner later. William had brought a small gift, a fountain pen that had belonged to William's father, carefully wrapped in tissue paper and tucked into his cardigan pocket. He was immensely proud of Michael, who had inherited both William's height and his unwavering sense of justice. The third generation of Jackson men fighting for what's right, William had said at the graduation, but the first one doing it with a law degree. As William settled onto his bench, he noticed a new face among the park's usual police presence. A young officer, probably in his early 30s, white, with close-cropped hair and a stiff posture that suggested military background. The officer, whose nameplate read Brennan, seemed to be paying particular attention to William's side of the park. William nodded politely when their eyes met. But Officer Brennan didn't return the gesture. Instead, he began walking a deliberate path that took him past William's bench every few minutes, each pass bringing him a little closer. His gaze a little more direct, a little more challenging. William felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came whenever he sensed trouble approaching. It was an old feeling, one he'd known since childhood, a sixth sense for detecting when his blackness was being perceived as a problem to be solved. He opened his book, determined to enjoy his afternoon despite the officer's attention. But after 20 minutes of this surveillance, the breadcrumbs distributed and the ducks now swimming contentedly away, Officer Brennan finally stopped directly in front of William's bench, his shadow falling across the open pages of poetry. "Afternoon," Brennan said, not as a greeting but as a challenge. "Mind if I ask what you're doing in this part of town?" William looked up, meeting the officer's eyes with a steady gaze. "Reading poetry, officer. Same as I do every Tuesday afternoon." "You live around here?" Brennan asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer and didn't believe it would be yes. "I live in West Side," William replied calmly. "But I've been coming to this park for over 50 years. Longer than you've been alive, I expect." He said this last part with a gentle smile, an attempt to diffuse the tension with humor. Officer Brennan didn't smile back. "Got some idea on you?" he asked, his hand resting casually on his belt, near his holster. William felt a flicker of indignation but suppressed it. At his age, in his skin, displaying anger to a police officer was a luxury he couldn't afford. "May I ask why you need my identification, officer?" "I'm simply sitting on a public bench." "Just routine," Brennan said, the words clipped. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area." William knew there was nothing routine about being asked for identification while reading poetry in a public park. But he also knew the choreography of these encounters, the steps he needed to follow to ensure he made it home safely. He carefully marked his place in his book with a pressed maple leaf he used as a bookmark, then reached for his wallet with deliberate, unthreatening movements. As he did so, he couldn't help but wonder what suspicious activity could possibly be attributed to an elderly man feeding ducks. And he couldn't help but notice that none of the white parkgoers seemed to be receiving the same scrutiny. What William and Officer Brennan didn't realize was that they were being observed from nearby. Police Commissioner Raymond Carter, 57, sat on a bench 50 yards away. Dressed in civilian clothes, a Washington Post newspaper partially concealing his face. Carter was a formidable presence even in plain clothes, his silver-streaked hair and athletic build marking him as someone accustomed to authority. After 30 years on the force and 3 years as Riverdale's first black police commissioner, Carter knew the park well, both as a public servant and as a father who had brought his own children here years ago. Today, however, he wasn't at Oakwood Park for relaxation. Over the past month, his office had received multiple complaints about aggressive policing in public spaces, particularly toward minority residents. Rather than launching a formal investigation immediately, Carter had decided to conduct his own undercover observations first. He wanted unfiltered truth, not the polished behavior officers displayed when they knew leadership was watching. When he'd spotted William Jackson on the bench, Carter had recognized him immediately. William had been principal when Carter's oldest daughter attended Riverdale High School, and had been a respected voice at community forums for decades. Carter had been about to approach and greet him when Officer Brennan had begun his circling pattern. Carter's instinct to say hello shifted to professional observation as he recognized the familiar signs of targeted surveillance. Now, as the interaction between William and the officer escalated, Carter remained still, recording the encounter discreetly with his phone positioned alongside his newspaper. Brennan took William's ID, studying it with exaggerated scrutiny. "William Jackson," he read aloud, as if testing the truth of the name against the man before him. "Says here you live on Maple Street. That's quite a ways from this park." "As I mentioned," I come here every Tuesday, William replied patiently. I used to be principal at Riverdale High School, just down the road. Many of my students came from this neighborhood. Brennan handed the ID back with obvious reluctance. We've had reports of drug activity in this area, he said, his eyes scanning William's cardigan and slacks as if they might conceal contraband. Specifically, older individuals acting as couriers. William nearly laughed at the absurdity of the suggestion. But the gravity in Brennan's face stopped him. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a deliberate attempt to intimidate. I assure you, Officer Brennan. The only things in my pockets are a handkerchief, my wallet, and a gift from my grandson. As William spoke, he noticed a family watching from the playground area, the mother whispering to her children while darting glances in their direction. On a nearby path, a jogger had slowed to observe. William felt the familiar weight of being a spectacle. His private moment transformed into public theater. I'm going to need you to empty your pockets, sir, Brennan said. The sir added as an afterthought. A thin veneer of respect over what was clearly becoming a baseless search. I don't consent to a search, William said, his voice firm but quiet. I've done nothing wrong. And you've provided no probable cause. William knew his rights. He had taught civics for decades, had lived through the evolution of these laws, had educated hundreds of young people about their constitutional protections. At 78, he was not about to surrender those rights without cause. Brennan's posture stiffened at the resistance. Sir, I need you to cooperate. We've had specific reports matching your description. William doubted very much that anyone had reported suspicious activity by an elderly black man in a cardigan reading Langston Hughes. What specific description would that be, officer? He asked, unable to keep a slight edge from his voice. I'd like to speak with your supervisor. At the mention of a supervisor, Brennan reached for his radio. This is Officer Brennan at Oakwood Park. I have an uncooperative subject who matches the description from the West Side Alert. Requesting backup. William felt his heart rate increase. The deliberate mischaracterization of his behavior as uncooperative was setting a dangerous stage. He had seen this pattern before. Had counseled countless young men about how these situations could escalate, had attended community meetings where similar encounters were dissected after ending in tragedy. Seeking to de-escalate. William reached slowly for his phone. I'm going to call my grandson, he explained calmly. He's a law student, and we're meeting for dinner. He can be here in 15 minutes. Brennan's reaction was immediate and alarming. Stop. Hands where I can see them, he barked, his hand moving to his holster. I said put your hands where I can see them. From his vantage point, Commissioner Carter tensed, his hand hovering over his own concealed weapon. He watched as William froze, his aged hands suspended in the air. His expression one of controlled fear. Carter weighed his options. Intervening now would expose his surveillance operation and potentially undermine the broader investigation into departmental practices. Not intervening could allow the situation to deteriorate further, possibly putting William at risk. He decided to continue recording but move slightly closer, ready to act if necessary. A second patrol car pulled into the park entrance, its lights flashing but sirens silent. Officer Brennan gestured toward it with obvious relief. My backup is here. Now. You're going to stand up slowly, and keep your hands visible at all times. William complied with careful precision, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. As he stood, the small package containing the fountain pen slipped from his pocket, falling to the ground between them. Brennan immediately reached for his weapon. Don't move, he ordered sharply. What is that? What did you just drop? It's a gift from my grandson, William explained, his voice steady despite his racing heart. A fountain pen that belonged to my father. Without warning, Brennan grabbed William's wrist, spinning the older man around and pushing him toward the patrol car. The sudden movement caused William's phone and wallet to fall from his lap, scattering Martha's photos across the pavement. William felt the cool metal of the car against his cheek, the officer's grip painfully tight on his thin wrist. Behind them, unknown to both, Commissioner Carter had stopped recording and was now standing, his decision made. The cold metal of the patrol car pressed against William's cheek as Officer Brennan maintained his grip on the elderly man's wrist. Pain radiated through William's arthritic joints. But it was the public humiliation that cut deepest. Parkgoers had stopped to stare, some with phones raised to record the scene, others hurrying past with averted eyes. William could feel blood beginning to trickle from where his temple had struck the edge of the car door. The physical discomfort was immediately overshadowed by a flood of memories, vivid and unwelcome. He was suddenly 19 again, pressed against a storefront window during a peaceful sit-in at a segregated lunch counter. He was 35. Being questioned by police for matching a description while walking home from a school board meeting. He was 50. Watching helplessly as officers roughly handled his teenage son for the crime of driving through an affluent neighborhood in a new car. Throughout his long life, William had believed things were changing, had to be changing. He had dedicated his career to education because he believed knowledge was the path to equality. He had seen laws transform, had witnessed a black man become president, had spoken at community forums alongside white allies who seemed to genuinely care about justice. Yet here he was, 78 years old, face pressed against a police car for sitting on a park bench. What had his lifetime of dignity and hard work amounted to, if this could still happen so easily? "Sir, please just relax," came the voice of the second officer who had arrived on scene. Officer Martinez was younger than Brennan, with an accent that suggested he'd grown up in the area. His tone held a note of uncertainty, a subtle indication that he wasn't comfortable with how the situation was unfolding. "We just need to sort this out." "There's nothing to sort out," William replied, his voice steady despite his position. "I was reading poetry in a public park, as I've done every week for years." Brennan began roughly searching through William's belongings, dumping the contents of his small bag onto the hood of the patrol car. The worn copy of Langston Hughes' poems fell awkwardly, its spine cracking as it landed, pages bending beneath its own weight. William winced at the sound. That book had been a gift from Martha on their 40th anniversary. "What's this?" Brennan demanded, holding up the small tissue-wrapped package that had fallen from William's pocket. Without waiting for an answer, he tore the wrapping, revealing the antique fountain pen inside. "I told you," William said, unable to keep a note of sadness from his voice. "It's a gift for my grandson. It belonged to my father." Brennan set the pen aside with obvious disappointment at not finding contraband. By now, a small crowd had gathered at a cautious distance. Among them was Sarah Chin, a young Asian American woman who had positioned herself to clearly capture the scene on her phone. When Brennan noticed her recording, his demeanor shifted subtly, his movements becoming more performative, more officially procedural. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back," he called to her. "This is a police matter." "I'm standing on public property," Sarah replied calmly, not lowering her phone. "I'm not interfering with your work." William felt a surge of gratitude toward this stranger who was bearing witness. In his experience, documentation was often the only protection available in these situations. Brennan returned his attention to William, flipping through the items from his wallet. He paused at William's retired educator ID card. "This is expired," he said dismissively. "It's a retirement ID," William explained patiently. "It doesn't expire because I'm permanently retired from Riverdale School District after 45 years of service." "Why am I being detained, officer?" William asked, his voice calm but firm. "What law have I broken by sitting in a public park?" Brennan didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "This is a nice neighborhood, sir. We have to make sure everyone here belongs." The implication was crystal clear to William, and apparently to Officer Martinez as well, who shifted uncomfortably beside his partner. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else," William stated, dignity evident in every syllable. My tax dollars help maintain this park, just like everyone else's. Throughout the interaction, William maintained his composure, drawing on decades of experience navigating a world that often viewed his very existence as threatening. Inside, however, his heart raced dangerously, and his breathing had become shallow. At 78, with a history of hypertension, this kind of stress posed real physical risks. He thought of Martha, of how distressed she would be to see him in this position. He thought of Michael, who would be waiting for him at the restaurant later. Proud of his new law degree and unaware that his grandfather was currently demonstrating exactly why such degrees were necessary. From his peripheral vision, William caught sight of movement near the oak trees. A tall black man in casual clothes was approaching with purpose, his bearing suggesting authority even in civilian dress. Their eyes met briefly, and William felt a flash of recognition, though he couldn't immediately place the man. Brennan didn't notice this new presence, continuing his unnecessary search of William's possessions. Sir, you need to tell me exactly what you're doing in this area of town, Brennan insisted, his tone suggesting no answer would be satisfactory. And I need the names of anyone you've met here today. Before William could respond, Brennan suddenly pushed him more firmly against the car, apparently interpreting some movement as resistance. The pressure caused William's temple to press harder against the door frame, the small cut there widening, blood now visibly trickling down his weathered face. Do you believe William should have stood up for his rights more forcefully, or was his calm dignity the right approach? Comment number 1 if you think direct confrontation would have been justified. Or number 2 if his patient response shows greater strength. In either case, an elderly man shouldn't face harassment for simply existing in public space. If you agree, please hit that like button and subscribe to see more stories that expose these everyday injustices. What would you do if you witnessed this happening in your community? And what happens when that mystery man finally steps forward? Let's continue this powerful story. The atmosphere in Oakwood Park seemed to freeze as the tall man in civilian clothes approached the scene with measured steps. Officer Brennan, still focused on William, remained oblivious to this new presence until a deep, authoritative voice cut through the tension. That's enough, officer. Brennan turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face at what he perceived as civilian interference. Sir, I need you to step back. This is police business. The newcomer stopped precisely 10 feet away. His posture relaxed yet commanding. I'm well aware it's police business, he replied, reaching into his pocket with deliberate slowness. That's exactly why I'm concerned. When his hand re-emerged, it held not a wallet but a badge, which he held up with practiced authority. Police Commissioner Raymond Carter. And I believe this situation has escalated quite far enough. The transformation in Brennan was immediate and dramatic. His face drained of color, his grip on William's arm loosening instantly. Behind him, Officer Martinez closed his eyes briefly in what appeared to be a mixture of relief and dread. Commissioner, Brennan stammered, taking a step back from William. I wasn't aware you were. I was responding to a suspicious person report, and the subject became uncooperative. Commissioner Carter approached slowly, his eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The scattered contents of William's wallet on the patrol car hood, the bent pages of the poetry book, the small trickle of blood on the elderly man's temple. His expression remained professionally neutral, but those close enough could see the controlled fury in his eyes. Mr. Jackson, Carter said, his voice softening as he addressed William directly. Are you all right, sir? The use of William's name was not lost on Officer Brennan, whose already pale face took on an ashen quality. William straightened himself with dignity, using a handkerchief to dab at the small cut on his temple. I've been better, Commissioner Carter. But I'm still standing. There was quiet strength in his voice, though those who knew him well might have detected the slight tremor beneath it. Carter nodded, then turned to Brennan with glacial calm. Officer, help Mr. Jackson to the bench. Carefully. As Brennan moved to comply, Carter added, "And Officer Martinez, please retrieve Mr. Jackson's belongings." With respect. The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their collective silence charged with anticipation. Sarah Chin continued filming, her phone capturing what had suddenly transformed from a troubling incident of harassment into something potentially historic for Riverdale. Once William was seated on the bench, Commissioner Carter knelt beside him, examining the cut on his temple with genuine concern. "I apologize on behalf of the Riverdale Police Department, Mr. Jackson. This is not how we train our officers to interact with respected community members. With any community members." William nodded in acknowledgement, his dignity intact despite the ordeal. "We've known each other a long time, Raymond," he said quietly. "Your daughter Aisha was one of my best students." Carter smiled briefly at the memory. "She's a surgeon now. Still quotes your lessons on perseverance when things get tough." He stood and turned to face the two officers. "Now, Officer Brennan, I'd like to hear about this suspicious person report you mentioned. Who called it in? What was the exact description provided?" Brennan shifted his weight uncomfortably. "It came through dispatch about an hour ago. Suspicious male in the park, possibly involved in narcotics." "And the description?" Carter pressed. "Black male, older." Brennan's voice had lost all its previous authority. "That's it. Black male, older?" Carter's tone was dangerously quiet. "That's the specific description that led you to detain a 78-year-old retired school principal reading poetry on a park bench he's visited weekly for decades?" Before Brennan could respond, Officer Martinez spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, I don't recall any such call coming through dispatch during our shift." The implication hung in the air, unavoidable and damning. Carter's expression hardened further. "Mr. Jackson, has Officer Brennan approached you in this park before today?" William carefully reordered the pages of his damaged book as he answered. "3 times in the past month. Never quite this aggressively, but yes. Always with similar questions about what I'm doing here, whether I live in the neighborhood." Martinez looked at his partner with new understanding dawning on his face. "Is that why you specifically wanted to patrol this section today? You said it was because of increased activity reports." Carter turned his full attention to Brennan. "Officer, do you routinely fabricate suspicious person reports to justify harassment of citizens who have committed no crime?" Before Brennan could formulate a response, a young black man in a crisp button-down shirt and jeans rushed into the scene, his face a mask of concern. "Grandpa," he called out, hurrying to William's side. "What happened? Are you okay?" "Michael," William said, his composure finally cracking slightly at the sight of his grandson. "I'm fine. Just a misunderstanding with Officer Brennan here." Michael Jackson took in the scene quickly, his newly minted legal mind cataloging details with professional precision even as personal concern dominated his expression. He noted the blood on his grandfather's temple, the scattered belongings, the 2 officers, and the commanding presence of Commissioner Carter. "A misunderstanding that resulted in my grandfather bleeding and being searched against his will?" Michael asked, his voice controlled but vibrating with intensity. He turned to Carter. "Commissioner, I've seen you speak at community forums. I'd like to know exactly what justified this level of force against a senior citizen with no criminal record." Carter nodded in acknowledgement. "A fair question, Mr. Jackson. I arrived partway through the interaction, but I've been recording since Officer Brennan first approached your grandfather. I believe we need a formal review of this incident, and potentially others involving Officer Brennan." Michael placed a protective arm around his grandfather's shoulders. "I'll be filing a formal complaint. And as a new member of the State Bar, I'll be requesting all body camera footage and dispatch records." Brennan's face, which had been pale, now flushed with anger. "This is being blown completely out of proportion. I was following standard procedure for suspicious person reports." "That's enough, officer," Carter cut him off. "Both of you will report to my office immediately after your shift ends today. Mr. Jackson, he turned to William, a medical response unit is already on the way. I'd like them to check that cut and make sure your blood pressure is stable. William started to protest, but Michael gently interrupted. Please, Grandpa. For my peace of mind, if nothing else. As they waited for the medical unit, Carter spoke quietly to both Jacksons. This won't be brushed aside. You have my word on that. The crowd had begun to disperse. But Sarah Chin approached cautiously, her phone now lowered. Mr. Jackson, she said respectfully, I have the whole interaction recorded, starting from when the officer first approached you. If you need it for your complaint, I'm happy to provide it. William looked at this young woman he never met before, this stranger who had chosen to bear witness when others looked away. Thank you, young lady. That's very kind. As the medical unit arrived and began checking William's injury, Commissioner Carter stepped aside to make a phone call. This incident wouldn't end with a band-aid and an apology. For Raymond Carter, it was the confirmation of patterns he had long suspected within his department. For William Jackson, it was a painful reminder that dignity was still something he had to fight for, even after 78 years of standing tall. For Michael Jackson, newly empowered with a law degree, it was the most personal possible illustration of why he had chosen his career path. And for Officer Brennan, though he didn't yet realize it, it was the beginning of the end of business as usual. By morning, Sarah Chen's video had accumulated over 50,000 views across multiple social media platforms. Local news stations had picked up the story, running headlines that ranged from the neutral confrontation between elderly man and police officer raises questions, to the more pointed, respected retired principal detained in park where he's visited for decades. William Jackson sat at his kitchen table, the morning sun streaming through windows that overlooked a small garden Martha had planted 15 years earlier. The cut on his temple had been declared minor by the medical responders, requiring only a butterfly bandage, but the headache that pulsed behind his eyes felt far from minor. His phone had been ringing since 7 a.m., old colleagues and former students calling to express outrage and support. He'd answered the first few calls but had eventually turned the ringer off, overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Michael sat across from him, laptop open, legal pad filled with neat handwriting beside it. The mayor's office released a statement, he said, scanning the screen. They're calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding and promising a thorough review of procedures. Standard damage control. William nodded absently, stirring honey into his tea. He hadn't wanted any of this. All he'd wanted was to read his poetry in peace, to feed the ducks, to carry on with the quiet routines that had kept him tethered since Martha's passing. Now he had become a symbol, his private humiliation transformed into public spectacle. Channel 7 wants an interview, Michael continued. So does the Riverdale Chronicle. And 3 national news outlets have reached out. William shook his head. I'm not interested in becoming the story of the week, then forgotten when something more sensational comes along. If this is going to matter, it needs to lead to real change. Outside William's modest home, a different kind of storm was brewing. The Riverdale Police Union had released a statement defending Officer Brennan, describing him as a decorated officer performing his duty in a high-crime area adjacent to Oakwood Park. The statement made no mention of William's status as a respected educator or the fact that the high-crime area reference was a thinly veiled description of West Side, the predominantly black neighborhood where William had lived and worked for decades. At the same time, Commissioner Carter found himself navigating treacherous political waters. The morning had begun with a tense phone call from Mayor Patricia Harrington, whose carefully modulated concern barely masked her primary worry about political fallout. Raymond, this is exactly the kind of situation we don't need right now, 6 months before an election, she'd said. The business community is nervous about the optics. The police union is already circling the wagons. We need to get ahead of this. Carter had listened silently before responding with characteristic directness. With all due respect, Mayor, What we don't need is a 78-year-old man being treated like a criminal for sitting on a park bench. What we don't need is officers fabricating reports to justify racial profiling. What we don't need is to sweep another incident under the rug and wonder why community trust continues to erode. The silence that followed had been frigid. When Mayor Harrington finally spoke, her tone had lost its collegial veneer. "Handle it quickly and quietly, Commissioner. That's all I'm saying." But quiet resolution seemed increasingly unlikely as the day progressed. By noon, former students of Principal Jackson had organized an impromptu rally outside Riverdale High School, where William had served as principal for 22 years. Nearly 200 people gathered, many holding hastily made signs with messages like, "Justice for Principal Jackson," and "Respect our elders, protect our community." Meanwhile, at Riverdale Police Headquarters, Commissioner Carter sat behind his desk, reviewing Officer Brennan's personnel file with growing concern. The official record showed a seemingly unremarkable 5-year career. Acceptable performance evaluations, standard commendations for service, 2 minor disciplinary notes for procedural violations. But Carter had spent the morning making calls to officers he trusted. And a different picture had emerged through these conversations. Brennan had a reputation among some colleagues for cleaning up certain neighborhoods, a euphemism Carter recognized all too well. More troubling, several civilian complaints had been filed against him over the past 2 years, all from minority residents, all dismissed during preliminary review before reaching Carter's desk. The system of internal filtering that was supposed to elevate serious concerns while screening out frivolous complaints had instead been burying a pattern of problematic behavior. When Carter's assistant notified him that William and Michael Jackson had arrived for their scheduled meeting, he set the file aside and stood to greet them. "Mr. Jackson," he said, shaking William's hand firmly, "I appreciate you coming in. How are you feeling today?" William's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've had better weeks, Commissioner. But I've had worse ones too." The comment wasn't flippant, Carter knew. For a man of William's age and experience, yesterday's humiliation, however profound, existed on a continuum of indignities both larger and smaller, stretching back through decades of American history that Carter had only experienced the tail end of. They settled into the chairs around a small conference table in Carter's office, Michael placing a digital recorder between them with a questioning look. Carter nodded his permission. "So," William began without preamble, "what happens now?" It was the essential question, cutting through potential platitudes and procedural explanations. Carter appreciated the directness. "Officer Brennan has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation," he said. "I've ordered a complete review of all civilian complaints filed against him. And I'm personally examining every suspicious person stop he's initiated in the past 6 months. Michael leaned forward. "And what about the broader pattern? Our community has been raising concerns about targeted policing for years, Commissioner. My grandfather's case is just the most visible example of what many people experience regularly." Carter didn't disagree. "That's why I was in the park yesterday, out of uniform. We've received multiple reports of questionable stops in public spaces. I've been conducting direct observation to see for myself what's happening on the ground." William considered this information. "You were watching before he approached me?" "Yes," Carter admitted. "I recognized you from community events, and was actually about to come say hello when I noticed Officer Brennan beginning to circle your bench. I made the decision to observe rather than intervene immediately, which I've been questioning ever since." "You got the evidence you needed," William said simply. "And I got a cut on my temple and a reminder that 78 years of living an exemplary life still isn't enough to protect me from suspicion." The rest of the meeting outlined next steps. The formal complaint process, the investigation timeline, the options for addressing the wider community concerns that Michael raised with the precision of his newly acquired legal training. As they prepared to leave, Carter walked them to the door, then hesitated. "Mr. Jackson, this is somewhat unusual, but I'd like to visit you at home tomorrow, if that would be acceptable." There are aspects of this situation I prefer to discuss outside this building. William studied the commissioner's face before nodding slowly. 4 o'clock. I'll put on a pot of coffee. That evening, William sat on his back porch, watching twilight settle over his garden. The news cycle was still churning, his phone still periodically lighting up with messages of support and media requests. Michael had gone to meet with several community activists who wanted to coordinate their response to the incident. The quiet moment alone was both welcome and disquieting. In the solitude, William found memories surfacing unbidden. Martha, sitting beside him on the same porch, her hand in his as they watched fireflies rise from the grass. The first time he'd been stopped by police as a teenager, his father's careful instructions playing in his mind, hands visible, voice respectful, movements slow. The pride he'd felt when appointed principal, and the weight of responsibility knowing he'd be scrutinized more closely than his predecessors. The way his heart had swelled when Michael had announced his intention to study law, and the shadow of worry that had accompanied that pride. William's reverie was interrupted by his neighbor, Elaine Washington, calling over the fence that separated their yards. "William? You doing okay over there? We've all been worried sick since we saw the news." William smiled at the 82-year-old woman who had been his neighbor for over 30 years. "I'm all right, Elaine. A little shaken up, but all right." Elaine's face was skeptical. "Well, just so you know, the whole block is watching out for you. Marcus 2 doors down said he's driving you to the park next week if you still want to go. None of us think you should stop your Tuesday routine because of one bad officer." The simple offer of solidarity brought unexpected tears to William's eyes. "Thank you, Elaine. I might take Marcus up on that." After Elaine returned to her evening gardening, William sat with the realization that he'd been experiencing anxiety about returning to the park. The thought of sitting on that same bench, wondering if each approaching figure might bring another confrontation, had been lurking beneath his conscious thoughts. It wasn't fear, exactly. Not after all he'd lived through. But it was a weariness, a heavy resignation that even now, even here, he couldn't simply exist in public space without the potential for his presence to be deemed suspicious. Later that night, as William prepared for bed, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. Normally he would have let it go to voicemail, but something prompted him to answer. "Mr. Jackson?" The voice was hesitant, young. "This is Officer Martinez, from yesterday at the park. I want to apologize for what happened, and I was hoping I could speak with you maybe tomorrow? There are things about Officer Brennan that I think you and Commissioner Carter should know." The community center auditorium was filled beyond capacity, the crowd spilling out into the hallway and onto the front steps of the building. What had been planned as a standard town hall meeting about police-community relations had transformed into something far more urgent in the wake of the Oakwood Park incident. Mayor Harrington sat at the center of the panel table on stage, flanked by Police Chief Gerald Wilson, Commissioner Carter, and several city council members. The tension in the room was palpable, with clear divisions visible in the seating arrangement. On one side, a contingent of officers in civilian clothes and their supporters had gathered, many wearing thin blue-line pins. On the other, community members from West Side and neighboring areas sat in organized groups, many sporting buttons reading, "Justice for Jackson," and "Reform Now." William and Michael Jackson sat in the front row, directly facing the panel. William wore a suit he normally reserved for special occasions, his posture erect, his expression composed but resolute. Mayor Harrington opened the proceedings with practiced diplomacy. "We're here tonight to have an open and productive dialogue about recent events and ongoing concerns regarding policing in our community. I want to emphasize that this administration is committed to ensuring that all citizens of Riverdale are treated with dignity and respect while maintaining the safety and security that everyone deserves." The carefully balanced statement was met with murmurs from both sides of the room, either satisfied by the non-committal phrasing. Chief Wilson spoke next. his silver hair and weathered face projecting an image of seasoned authority. The department acknowledges the concern over the incident involving Mr. Jackson. Officer Brennan has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. I want to assure the public that this is being taken seriously. But I also urge everyone to remember that our officers face difficult situations daily and deserve the benefit of proper procedure before judgments are made. This elicited nods from the pro-police contingent and visible frustration from many community members. When it was Commissioner Carter's turn to speak, he stood rather than remaining seated like the previous speakers. I was present at Oakwood Park during the incident involving William Jackson, he began, his deep voice commanding immediate attention. I witnessed firsthand an interaction that was not in line with our department's stated values or training. But more importantly, I've spent the past week reviewing data that suggests this was not an isolated incident. He turned slightly to face Chief Wilson. With the chief's permission, I'd like to share some findings with the community. Wilson's jaw tightened visibly, but he nodded once, sharply. Carter activated a presentation on the screen behind the panel. In the past 18 months, pedestrian stops in public spaces have increased by 62%. Over 80% of those stopped were people of color. In a city where people of color make up 37% of the population. A ripple of reaction moved through the audience as Carter continued, methodically presenting statistics on disparities in who was stopped, searched, cited, and arrested across different neighborhoods in Riverdale. The data painted a clear picture of systematic differences in how policing was experienced depending on race and geography. These numbers tell a story, Carter concluded. Not of a few bad apples or isolated incidents, but of systems that produce predictable and disparate outcomes regardless of individual intentions. The auditorium had grown completely silent. Carter's presentation had shifted the conversation from the specific incident with William to the broader patterns that made such incidents inevitable. Mayor Harrington, visibly uncomfortable with the direction the meeting had taken, quickly moved to open the floor for public comments. William Jackson was the first to approach the microphone. "My name is William Jackson," he began, though no introduction was necessary in a room where his face had been on everyone's screens for the past week. "I've lived in this city for 78 years. I've educated its children, served on its civic committees, paid my taxes, and contributed to its growth. Last week, I was treated like a criminal for sitting on a park bench and reading poetry." His voice remained steady as he recounted the details of the incident, the indignity of the search, the physical pain of being pressed against the patrol car. "But what happened to me isn't about me," he continued. "It's about every person who changes their route home because they don't want to be questioned. Every parent who has to teach their children special rules for surviving encounters with those sworn to protect them. Every citizen who cannot simply exist in public space without justification." The room was absolutely still as William spoke. "I don't want Officer Brennan's badge. I want change that ensures no one else has to experience what I experienced. I want systems of accountability that don't require a police commissioner to be coincidentally present for justice to be possible. I want the promise of equal protection under the law that I've been hearing about for 7 decades to finally be fulfilled." The applause that followed William's statement was thunderous from the community side of the room, polite but restrained from the pro-police contingent. What followed was 2 hours of intense testimony. Community members shared experiences mirroring William's, describing stops, searches, and harassment that had never made headlines. Several former students of Principal Jackson spoke about his impact on their lives and their outrage at his treatment. On the other side, officers and their supporters emphasized the challenges of policing, the split-second decisions required, and their concern that a few controversial incidents were being used to undermine public trust in law enforcement. The meeting reached a turning point when Sarah Chin approached the microphone. The young woman whose video had catalyzed the public response spoke with quiet intensity. "I've lived in Oakwood Heights for 3 years," she began, identifying herself as a resident of the affluent, predominantly white neighborhood adjacent to the park. In that time, I've seen Officer Brennan interact with people in the park repeatedly. What happened to Mr. Jackson wasn't unusual except that someone was filming and a commissioner was watching. She held up her phone. I have additional videos from the past 6 months showing Officer Brennan approaching people of color in the park with no apparent cause. I've submitted them to Commissioner Carter's office. But I want everyone here to know they exist. The revelation caused an immediate stir. Chief Wilson leaned over to whisper urgently to Mayor Harrington, while Commissioner Carter nodded in confirmation that he had indeed received the footage. When the meeting finally concluded, little had been resolved in concrete terms. Mayor Harrington promised a comprehensive review of departmental policies, and ongoing dialogue with all stakeholders. Political language that committed to process rather than specific outcomes. As the crowd began to disperse, Michael Jackson found himself approached by a young officer in civilian clothes who introduced himself as Martinez. "I spoke with your grandfather yesterday," Martinez said quietly. "I've submitted a formal statement about what I've observed while partnered with Brennan. I want you to know not everyone on the force thinks what happened was acceptable." Before Michael could respond, Commissioner Carter joined them. "Officer Martinez has taken a significant professional risk by coming forward," Carter explained. "He's provided evidence that Officer Brennan has systematically falsified reports to justify stops of minorities in Oakwood Park and surrounding areas." Michael processed this information, its implications expanding the scope of the case beyond a single incident to something that might actually drive structural change. Meanwhile, across the room, William found himself surrounded by former students and community members offering support. Among them was James Henderson, a city council member who had once been in William's first senior class as principal. "Mr. Jackson," Henderson said, the formality of address never having faded despite the decades since he'd been a student, "this isn't right. The mayor's trying to run out the clock on this. Wait until public attention fades. We can't let that happen." William nodded in agreement. "What do you suggest, James?" Henderson lowered his voice. "I've been on council for 12 years. I know where the bodies are buried. So to speak. Give me a few days to gather some information that might help ensure this doesn't get swept under the rug." As the meeting room finally emptied, William and Michael walked slowly to their car, both mentally exhausted from the emotional intensity of the evening. Neither noticed the unmarked police vehicle across the street, where Chief Wilson sat watching them with a calculated expression. Inside the car, he made a phone call. "Mayor? Wilson. We have a problem. Carter's gone rogue with this Jackson situation. And it looks like he's got support on the council. We need to contain this before it affects the entire department." The ripples from what had happened on a park bench were expanding into waves, threatening to overturn systems that had remained stable through decades of inertia. But for those systems to change, the pressure would need to be sustained. And the forces invested in maintaining the status quo were already mobilizing their considerable resources to resist. Have you ever witnessed an injustice and stayed silent, unsure of what to do? Comment number 1 if you've been in a situation where speaking up felt risky but necessary, or number 2 if you've regretted not intervening when you could have. If this story is revealing important truths about how power protects itself, please hit that like button and subscribe to support more content that confronts difficult realities. What do you think will happen as city officials try to silence Commissioner Carter? Will William's case become another forgotten headline, or could this be the beginning of real change? The battle lines are being drawn, and what happens next might surprise you. The headline on the Riverdale Chronicle's front page was stark in its simplicity. Police Commissioner Carter placed on administrative leave. William Jackson read it twice, his morning coffee cooling untouched beside the newspaper. It had been 10 days since the town hall meeting, 10 days of intensifying pressure and counterforce as the consequences of his encounter with Officer Brennan continued to ripple outward. He reached for his phone to call Michael, but it rang before he could dial, his grandson's name appearing on the screen. I just saw the news, William said by way of greeting. They're trying to shut him down. Michael's voice was tight with controlled anger. It's a transparent attempt to derail the investigation. They're claiming Carter violated department protocol by conducting unauthorized surveillance and failing to intervene immediately when witnessing potential misconduct. They're using his integrity against him. The irony wasn't lost on William. Commissioner Carter was being punished for documenting the very behavior the department had long denied existed. What does this mean for the investigation into Brennan? Michael's sigh carried through the phone. It's supposedly continuing under Chief Wilson's direct supervision, which effectively means it's being buried. But we're not letting this go, Grandpa. I'm meeting with a coalition of community organizations this afternoon to coordinate our response. After hanging up, William sat motionless at his kitchen table, a heaviness settling in his chest that wasn't entirely emotional. At 78, stress manifested physically in ways it hadn't when he was younger. The pressure behind his sternum had been increasing over the past week as the situation escalated. He mentioned it to no one, not wanting to worry Michael or distract from the important work being done. The community's response to his incident had grown far beyond anything William had anticipated. What had begun as outrage over his specific treatment had catalyzed into a broader movement demanding accountability and reform. Hundreds had attended rallies, thousands had signed petitions, and donations had poured in to establish a legal fund for addressing cases of police misconduct. But the backlash had been equally powerful. The police union had closed ranks around Brennan, framing him as a dedicated officer being sacrificed to political correctness. City officials, initially sympathetic in public statements, had begun emphasizing the need for balanced perspective and supporting our law enforcement professionals. Most troubling, Officer Brennan had been quietly transferred to a neighboring district rather than facing any disciplinary action, a bureaucratic maneuver designed to make the problem disappear without addressing it. William was still sitting at the table, lost in thought, when a sharp knock at his front door startled him back to the present. He opened it to find James Henderson, the city council member and former student, standing on his porch with an expression of grim determination. "Mr. Jackson," Henderson said, his formal address at odds with the urgency in his voice. "May I come in? There's something you need to see." At the community center across town, Michael Jackson stood before a room filled with representatives from local civil rights organizations, faith groups, and neighborhood associations. The energy was electric. A combination of outrage over Commissioner Carter's suspension and determination to prevent the momentum for change from being stalled. "They're hoping we'll lose interest," Michael told the assembled group. "That we'll accept vague promises of future review and go back to business as usual. That's been the playbook for decades. And it's worked because the system is designed to exhaust us." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room as Michael continued. "But this time is different. We have evidence, we have witnesses. We have community solidarity across neighborhoods, and we have a legal strategy." That strategy had been developing rapidly over the past week, with Michael leveraging his new legal credentials and the expertise of established civil rights attorneys to build a case that went beyond his grandfather's individual experience to challenge the SYST. Issues it exemplified. The meeting was interrupted by a commotion at the door as Sarah Chin entered, her face flushed with excitement or exertion. "Sorry I'm late," she said, hurrying to the front of the room. "But I've got something everyone needs to see." She connected her laptop to the projector, and the screen filled with what appeared to be an internal police department email chain. "A friend in the IT department sent this to me an hour ago," Sarah explained. "They're risking their job by leaking it, so we need to protect their identity." The emails detailed a coordinated effort by department leadership to transfer officers with multiple civilian complaints to different districts rather than addressing the underlying behavior, effectively spreading the problem while creating the illusion of resolution. Officer Brennan was mentioned specifically, with Chief Wilson instructing a captain to Handle the transfer quietly and make sure the paperwork reflects performance reasons rather than the Jackson incident. Michael stared at the screen. The implications immediately clear. This isn't just about one officer or one incident, he said slowly. This is evidence of a department-wide policy to evade accountability. Across town, William Jackson and James Henderson sat in William's living room, reviewing a different set of documents. I've been on the budget committee for 8 years, Henderson explained, pointing to highlighted sections of the thick printout before them. These are arrest and citation statistics by district for the past 5 years. Cross-reference with department funding allocations. William studied the numbers, his decades as an educator having equipped him with a facility for data analysis. They're incentivizing arrests in certain neighborhoods, he said after a moment, the pattern becoming clear. The districts with higher minority populations have unofficial quotas. Henderson nodded grimly. Exactly. Officers like Brennan aren't just bad apples. They're responding to systemic incentives. Districts with higher arrest numbers get additional funding, preferred equipment, better shift assignments. It's never stated explicitly, but the correlation is undeniable. The revelation reinforced what many in the community had long suspected but could never prove. That the disparities in policing weren't just the result of individual bias but were baked into the structure of the department itself. As William processed this information, a sharp pain lanced through his chest, more intense than the pressure he'd been experiencing over the past week. He gasped involuntarily, his hand rising to his sternum. "Mr. Jackson?" Henderson's voice seemed to come from a distance. "Are you all right, William?" The room tilted alarmingly, the documents sliding from William's lap as he slumped in his chair. Henderson was immediately beside him, phone in hand, calling for an ambulance. "Stay with me, Mr. Jackson," he urged, his former teacher's ashen face triggering both professional concern and personal alarm. "Help is on the way." The news of William Jackson's collapse spread rapidly through the community networks that had formed around his case. Michael rushed to the hospital, arriving to find his grandfather connected to monitors, looking smaller and more vulnerable than he had ever seen him. "Stress-induced cardiac event," the doctor explained quietly. "Not a full heart attack, but a warning sign we need to take seriously." His blood pressure was dangerously elevated. William, conscious but sedated, reached for Michael's hand. "Don't let them use this to distract from what matters," he said, his voice weaker than usual but his determination undiminished. "They'll say I'm too fragile for the stress of pursuing this. Don't let them use my health to silence our community." Michael squeezed his grandfather's hand, fighting back tears. "No one's silencing anything, Grandpa. We're just getting started." That evening, as William rested under medical supervision, an unprecedented meeting took place in the private room of a local restaurant. Commissioner Carter, still officially on administrative leave, sat at a table with Michael Jackson, James Henderson, Sarah Chin, and leaders from 3 community organizations. The unlikely coalition had gathered at Carter's request, converging from different directions and arriving at staggered times to avoid drawing attention. "What I'm about to share could end my career," Carter began without preamble. "But after 30 years in law enforcement, I've concluded that the system as currently structured cannot reform itself." He placed a thumb drive on the table. "This contains departmental data on stop and frisk incidents, use of force reports, and complaint dispositions for the past decade, broken down by race, neighborhood, and officer. It definitively demonstrates patterns that the department has repeatedly denied exist." The group stared at the small device, understanding the magnitude of what it represented, both in terms of evidence and the risk Carter was taking by providing it. "The chief is moving to file charges against me for breach of confidential information," Carter continued. "Once that happens, my ability to effect change from within will be gone. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Michael looked around the table at the assembled allies, each bringing different strengths to the fight. "Then we move immediately, on multiple fronts. A legal challenge based on pattern and practice violations. public pressure through coordinated community action, and strategic use of this data to demonstrate that what happened to my grandfather reflects systematic problems, not isolated incidents. From his hospital bed, William Jackson signed the papers that would make him the lead plaintiff in a class action lawsuit against the Riverdale Police Department. The doctors had advised against any stress or excitement, but William had been adamant. "I've been fighting for dignity my entire life," he told the concerned physician. "I'm not stopping now because my heart reminds me I'm mortal." The lawsuit, officially filed the next morning, named not only Officer Brennan but Chief Wilson, Mayor Harrington, and the department as institutional defendants. It sought not only damages for William and other affected individuals but structural remedies including independent oversight, revised training, and accountability mechanisms. The response was swift and forceful. The police union issued a statement condemning the politically motivated attack on hardworking officers. The mayor's office released a carefully worded expression of disappointment that legal adversaries have replaced collaborative dialogue. And Chief Wilson announced a press conference for the following day, promising to set the record straight about recent mischaracterizations of our department. But before that press conference could take place, the thumb drive Commissioner Carter had provided found its way to 3 journalists from different news outlets. By morning, the data it contained had transformed the narrative from a dispute over one incident to incontrovertible evidence of systemic discrimination. The chief's press conference, intended to regain control of the story, instead became a defensive response to questions about damning statistics that could no longer be denied or explained away. And in a development no one had anticipated, Officer Martinez, joined by 4 other officers from diverse backgrounds, held their own impromptu press conference on the steps of City Hall. "We joined the force to protect and serve all communities," Martinez stated, his colleagues nodding in solemn agreement beside him. "The patterns revealed in this data do not reflect the values we swore to uphold. We stand with Commissioner Carter and call for the reforms necessary to restore trust and ensure justice for everyone in Riverdale." The breaking point had been reached. What had begun with William Jackson sitting on a park bench had escalated into a fundamental challenge to systems that had operated unchecked for generations. The question now was whether this momentum could be sustained long enough to create lasting change, or whether the powerful forces arrayed against reform would once again manage to weather the storm until public attention inevitably shifted elsewhere. Morning sunlight streamed across Oakwood Park, illuminating a scene unlike any in the park's long history. Where weeks earlier William Jackson had sat alone on his bench, thousands now gathered, their presence transforming the manicured grounds into a sea of movement and color. Signs bobbed above the crowd, bearing messages like, "Justice is not negotiable," and "Reform now, not later." At the center of it all, a temporary stage had been erected near William's bench, which had become a symbolic focal point in the growing movement. William himself arrived in a wheelchair pushed by Michael, his recent health scare necessitating the accommodation despite his protests that he could manage with a cane. The crowd parted respectfully as they made their way toward the stage, many reaching out to touch William's shoulder or clasp his hand in a show of solidarity. The physicians had strongly advised against his attendance, but William had been adamant. "If you're concerned about my heart," he had told the cardiologist, "understand that seeing this through is the best medicine I could receive." The demonstration had been meticulously organized by the coalition that had formed in the wake of William's incident. Community groups, faith leaders, civil rights organizations, and even business associations had come together in an unprecedented alliance. National media outlets had dispatched reporters, their vans parked along the perimeter of the park, satellite dishes raised like mechanical flowers turning toward the sun. As William was helped onto the stage, he noticed a tall figure in the distance, standing slightly apart from the crowd. Even from this distance, the dress uniform was unmistakable, the polished insignia catching the morning light. Commissioner Raymond Carter had come in full ceremonial attire despite his suspension. A visual statement of his continued commitment to his oath of service rather than to the department currently attempting to silence him. The program began with an interfaith invocation, followed by speeches from community leaders articulating specific demands for reform. The crowd listened attentively, their energy focused and purposeful rather than chaotic. This was not a spontaneous gathering but the culmination of weeks of organizing, relationship building, and strategic planning. When it was Michael's turn to speak, he approached the microphone with the measured confidence of someone who had found his purpose. 3 weeks ago, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd. My grandfather sat on a bench in this park, as he has done every Tuesday for decades. He was reading poetry, feeding ducks, existing peacefully in public space. For this, he was treated as suspicious, detained without cause, physically handled to the point of injury, and humiliated in a community he has served for over half a century. Michael paused, allowing the reality of these facts to resonate. What happened next was not in the script power usually follows. Because Commissioner Carter witnessed the incident, because Sarah Chen recorded it, because Officer Martinez spoke up, because community members like all of you refused to look away, this incident did not fade from memory, as so many others have. The crowd murmured in agreement as Michael continued. Since then, we have uncovered evidence of systematic discrimination in how policing is conducted in Riverdale. Not isolated incidents, not a few bad actors, but structural patterns that produce predictable disparities regardless of individual intentions. He held up a thick document. This lawsuit, with my grandfather as lead plaintiff, is not just about what happened to him. It's about creating mechanisms of accountability that don't rely on the coincidental presence of a police commissioner to ensure justice is served. As Michael spoke, Mayor Harrington's chief of staff was frantically trying to reach her. The demonstration had drawn far more participants than city officials had anticipated, and the narrative was clearly beyond their control. More concerning, sources within the Justice Department had informed the mayor's office that federal investigators were monitoring the situation and considering launching their own inquiry into the Riverdale Police Department's practices. After several attempts, the call finally connected. Madam Mayor, we need to reconsider our position, the chief of staff urged, his voice tense. This isn't going away. And the federal interest changes the calculation significantly. Mayor Harrington, watching the live coverage of the demonstration from her office, recognized the political reality shifting beneath her feet. Her initial strategy of minimizing the incident and waiting for public attention to fade had clearly failed. Now she faced a choice between getting ahead of the change that was coming or being perceived as an obstacle to progress. Set up a meeting with the community leadership, she instructed after a moment's consideration, and find out what it would take to reinstate Commissioner Carter before this gets any further out of hand. Back at the park, William Jackson was helped to the microphone, the crowd falling completely silent as he prepared to speak. His recent hospitalization had left him physically weaker but had somehow intensified the moral authority he projected. I have lived in Riverdale for 78 years, he began, his voice less powerful than in his days addressing school assemblies, but no less commanding of attention. I have seen this community at its worst and at its best. I have seen progress and regression, hope and disappointment, promises kept and promises broken. William gripped the sides of the podium, steadying himself. What happened to me in this park was not the worst injustice I have witnessed or experienced in my lifetime. But perhaps it can be the last of its kind if we use this moment to create the change that has been too long deferred. As William spoke, a commotion at the edge of the crowd drew attention. A police cruiser had pulled up, and from it emerged a familiar figure, Officer Brennan. His appearance caused an immediate ripple of tension through the gathering, people turning to stare with a mixture of anger and disbelief at his audacity in showing up. But Brennan hadn't come to confront or counter-protest. Instead, he stood at the periphery. Not in uniform but in civilian clothes, his posture suggesting uncertainty rather than defiance. Only a few people noticed the second figure who emerged from the car after him, Officer Martinez, who had clearly brought his former partner to the demonstration despite the professional risk of being associated with him. Commissioner Carter, observing from his position at the edge of the crowd, made note of this unexpected development but remained where he was, allowing the community's moment to unfold without his official presence complicating it. William concluded his remarks with a call for unity of purpose. This is not about punishment but about transformation. Not about assigning blame but about accepting responsibility. Not about dividing our community but about healing it. The path forward requires courage from all of us, including those who wear the badge and those who have felt targeted by it. The demonstration continued throughout the morning, speeches alternating with musical performances and spoken word poetry addressing themes of justice and community. By early afternoon, word began spreading through the crowd that the mayor had requested a meeting with the coalition leadership, a development that was cautiously interpreted as a positive sign. As the organized program concluded and people began dispersing, William found himself approached by a city official he recognized from community meetings. "Mr. Jackson," the woman said respectfully, "the mayor would like to meet with you and your grandson, along with other community representatives, at City Hall tomorrow morning. She's prepared to discuss concrete reforms, including Commissioner Carter's reinstatement." William exchanged a look with Michael, both understanding that this represented a significant shift in the city's stance. "We'll be there," William confirmed, with specific proposals already prepared. As the crowd thinned, William asked Michael to wheel him toward his usual bench. After the intensity of the morning, he felt the need to reconnect with the peaceful spot that had been the catalyst for everything that followed. As they approached, they were surprised to find Commissioner Carter already seated there, now in civilian clothes, having changed out of his dress uniform. "May I join you?" William asked, gesturing to the space beside Carter. "It is your bench," Carter replied with a small smile, moving aside to make room for the wheelchair. For a few minutes, the three men sat in companionable silence, watching the park return to its usual tranquility as the last demonstrators departed. "They're feeling the pressure," Carter finally said, referring to city leadership. "The question is whether they're ready for genuine change or just looking for the fastest way to make this go away." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "That's why we need to be absolutely clear about what meaningful reform looks like. No vague commitments, no processes that can be extended indefinitely until attention fades. We need to be strategic about our demands," Carter advised. "Push for changes that will be difficult to reverse once implemented. Independent oversight with real authority. Revised training that addresses implicit bias. Transparent data on stops and use of force." Their conversation was interrupted by the unexpected approach of Officer Brennan, who had apparently been working up the courage to approach. Martinez stood a few steps behind him, his expression a mixture of encouragement and wariness. "Mr. Jackson," Brennan began, his voice strained with evident discomfort. "I wanted to, that is, I felt I should." William studied the younger man's face, seeing conflict and uncertainty where there had been only arrogant authority weeks earlier. "Why don't you have a seat, Officer Brennan?" William suggested, gesturing to the other end of the bench. "This bench has plenty of room for everyone." It was a deliberately pointed invitation, highlighting the absurdity of William having been considered suspicious for occupying this same public space. Brennan hesitated, then sat stiffly, clearly struggling to find words. "I've been required to complete bias recognition training," he finally said, "and to review the body camera footage of our interaction. I wanted to say that he faltered, "I made assumptions based on. I didn't consider." William waited patiently, neither helping Brennan articulate his thoughts nor interrupting them. This halting attempt at reckoning was part of the process, however uncomfortable. "I made assumptions," Brennan finally managed more clearly. "About who belongs where. About what suspicious looks like. I can see now how those assumptions affected my actions that day." It wasn't exactly an apology, William noted, but perhaps it was something more important, the beginning of self-reflection. Recognition is the first step, William said after a moment. The harder work is changing the patterns that have been reinforced throughout your life and career. Brennan nodded uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for a conversation of this depth but making an effort nonetheless. The department is changing, he said. Some officers are resistant, but others are rethinking things. Martinez has been helping me see perspectives I hadn't considered. The unlikely group continued their conversation as afternoon shadows lengthened across the park. No miraculous transformations occurred, no dramatic reconciliations. But in the measured exchange of perspectives, in the difficult acknowledgement of harm caused and responsibility accepted, the first fragile threads of understanding began to form. These threads, William reflected, when woven together with policy changes and structural reforms, might eventually create a fabric strong enough to support the weight of true community healing. As the sun began to set, William looked around at the park that had been his sanctuary for so many years, the site of both humiliation and now potential transformation. The tide was turning, slowly but perceptibly, toward justice. And while he harbored no illusions about how difficult the path ahead remained, for the first time in weeks, William felt something that had been in short supply: hope. 6 months later, William Jackson walked slowly but steadily toward his familiar bench in Oakwood Park, leaning only slightly on a polished walnut cane. The late spring air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and flowering dogwoods, a perfect Tuesday afternoon for his weekly ritual. His health had improved considerably since his hospitalization, partly due to new medication but perhaps equally because of the sense of purpose that had infused his life in recent months. As he settled onto the bench, William noticed subtle changes in the park that most visitors might overlook. New signage detailing park rules emphasized that all community members had equal right to enjoy the public space. A small plaque had been affixed to his bench, not mentioning him by name at his insistence, but reading simply, "Dignity is not negotiable," alongside the date of the incident that had catalyzed so much change. Most significantly, the nature of police presence in the park had transformed. Officers now walked in pairs, often including one from the newly formed Community Bridge Unit, specially trained officers focused on relationship building rather than enforcement. They greeted parkgoers with respectful nods rather than suspicious glances, their body language conveying service rather than surveillance. These visible changes reflected deeper transformations within the Riverdale Police Department over the past half-year. Commissioner Carter's Dignity First initiative, implemented after his reinstatement with expanded authority, had fundamentally reoriented departmental priorities. Officers now received extensive training on implicit bias, de-escalation techniques, and the historical context of policing in minority communities. More importantly, evaluation metrics had been overhauled to emphasize community engagement and problem-solving rather than arrest and citation numbers. William opened his worn copy of Langston Hughes' poems, its damaged spine now carefully repaired, and began his Tuesday reading ritual. He had just settled into the familiar rhythm of "I, too," when a shadow fell across the page. Looking up, he was surprised to see Officer Kevin Brennan standing before him, not in uniform but in civilian clothes. "Mr. Jackson," Brennan said, his demeanor markedly different from their first encounter 6 months earlier. "I was hoping I might find you here today." William marked his place in the book and gestured to the space beside him. "Have a seat, Officer Brennan." Brennan sat, maintaining a respectful distance. "Actually, it's just Kevin now," he said. "I resigned from the force last month." This was unexpected news to William. After the incident, Brennan had been required to complete extensive retraining and community service as part of his disciplinary action. But as far as William knew, he had remained employed by the department. "May I ask why?" William inquired, genuinely curious rather than judgmental. Brennan looked out across the park, gathering his thoughts before responding. The changes Commissioner Carter implemented are good ones. Important ones. But as I went through the training and really confronted my own assumptions, the patterns in my behavior, I realized I needed to step back and reconsider whether policing is the right career for me. He paused, then added, I'm going back to school, actually. Social work. I thought maybe I could help in a different way. William nodded thoughtfully. In his decades as an educator, he had seen many young people find their true calling through detours and reconsiderations. That takes courage, he acknowledged, to change direction based on difficult self-reflection. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Commissioner Carter, now a regular participant in William's Tuesday afternoon ritual. Since his reinstatement, Carter had made a point of being visible in the community not just as a symbol of authority, but as a fellow citizen. His weekly chess games with William in the park had become a tradition that symbolized the new relationship being forged between law enforcement and the community. Kevin, Carter said with evident surprise, shaking the younger man's hand. I hadn't heard about your decision. Martinez mentioned you were considering a change, but I didn't realize you'd made it official. Brennan stood respectfully. Yes, sir. I submitted my resignation 3 weeks ago. I wanted to tell Mr. Jackson in person, after Brennan departed. Promising to keep both men updated on his educational journey, Carter set up the chess set he'd brought along. Your move first today, I believe, he said, arranging the pieces. As they began their game, a group of new police academy graduates walked through the park, accompanied by Officer Martinez, who had been promoted to training officer for the Community Engagement Program. The young officers were noticeably diverse in both race and gender, reflecting Carter's aggressive recruitment efforts to make the department more representative of the community it served. Martinez guided his trainees toward William's bench, where they stopped at a respectful distance. Mr. Jackson, Commissioner, Martinez greeted them. I'd like to introduce our newest graduates. They're beginning the community immersion phase of their training. William looked up from the chessboard, studying the fresh-faced officers. Welcome to Oakwood Park, he said warmly. I hope you'll visit often and get to know the regulars here. One of the new officers, a young black woman, stepped forward slightly. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Jackson, she said. We've studied your case as part of our training curriculum. It's required learning now. William hadn't known this specific detail of the department's reforms, and he felt a complex wave of emotion at the knowledge that his experience was being used to educate future officers. Make sure you learn the right lessons from it, he advised the group. Not just about what went wrong that day, but about the systems that made it possible and the community that came together to change those systems. After the training group continued their tour, William moved his bishop decisively, capturing one of Carter's knights. Checkmate in 5 moves, he predicted with a small smile. Carter studied the board, eyebrows raised. You're getting better at this. Or I'm getting worse. Neither, William replied. I'm just more focused now that I have a purpose again. That purpose had manifested in multiple ways since the lawsuit settlement 6 months earlier. While the financial compensation had been substantial, far more significant were the structural reforms the city had agreed to implement. William had been appointed honorary chairperson of the newly established Citizen Oversight Committee, which had real authority to review police conduct and recommend disciplinary action when necessary. More personally meaningful to William was the mentorship program he had helped design, pairing officers with community elders to facilitate genuine relationship building across generations and experiences. The program had initially faced skepticism from both officers and community members, but its impact was becoming increasingly evident as mutual understanding gradually replaced ingrained suspicion. As William and Carter continued their chess match, Michael arrived, briefcase in hand, having come directly from the community legal clinic he had established with part of the settlement funds. The clinic specialized in cases involving police accountability and civil rights, providing resources to those who might otherwise lack access to legal representation. How's your day been, Grandpa? Michael asked, settling onto the bench beside them. Busy, William replied. I met with the curriculum committee this morning. We're finalizing the Civil Rights History program for the new community center. The center, currently under construction at the edge of the park, represented perhaps the most visible legacy of William's case. Funded through a combination of the settlement, city allocations, and community donations, it would provide educational programs, meeting spaces, and resources focused on civil rights, civic engagement, and community building. Michael nodded approval, then turned to Commissioner Carter. The first class of officers trained under the new protocols graduates next week, doesn't it? Carter confirmed with evident pride. 28 officers who've gone through the most comprehensive training program in department history. The focus on community engagement and de-escalation is completely different from how I was trained 30 years ago. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, a small gathering formed around William's bench. Officer Martinez stopped by again after completing his training tour. Sarah Chen arrived with community center architectural plans for William's review. James Henderson came directly from a city council meeting with updates on implementation of the reform agreements. What had begun as a solitary ritual had evolved into an informal community hub, a living demonstration of the new connections being forged. Later, as the park began to empty with the setting sun, William, Michael, and Commissioner Carter walked together along the path toward the parking area. William moved more slowly than he once had, but with dignity and purpose in every step. A group of diverse young officers nodded respectfully as they passed, a simple acknowledgement that would have seemed unlikely 6 months earlier. We're just getting started, Michael said, surveying the park that had become both a symbol of injustice and a launching pad for change. The reforms look good on paper, but the real work is making sure they're fully implemented and sustained over time. Commissioner Carter nodded in agreement. Changing policies is the easy part. Changing culture takes generations. William listened to their assessment with the perspective of someone who had witnessed multiple cycles of progress and regression throughout his long life. What's different this time, he observed, is that we're changing both the rules and the relationships. One without the other never lasts. As they reached Michael's car, William paused for a moment, looking back at his bench in the distance. 6 months ago, he had sat there as an individual subjected to humiliation and injustice. Today, that same bench represented a community united in purpose, an intergenerational movement for dignity, and his own renewed sense of meaning in the final chapter of his life. The incident that had begun with blood trickling down his temple had become the catalyst for healing wounds far deeper and more long-standing, both personal and communal. William knew better than to believe that all problems had been solved or that the work of justice was complete. But as he settled into the passenger seat of Michael's car, he carried with him something that had been in short supply throughout much of his 78 years, not just hope for change, but evidence of its possibility. What do you think about William's journey from victim to catalyst for change? Has this story shifted your perspective on how individuals can impact systems that seem too powerful to change? If you found value in this exploration of dignity, justice, and community transformation, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, can create ripples that become waves of meaningful change. Thank you for witnessing William's story, and remember, dignity is non-negotiable for anyone, anywhere, at any time. William Jackson's story teaches us that dignity is non-negotiable, regardless of age, race, or circumstance. When faced with unjust treatment, William demonstrated that maintaining personal dignity doesn't mean accepting injustice. It means confronting it with the quiet strength that comes from knowing your own worth. The incident in Oakwood Park reveals how systemic discrimination persists not through dramatic events but through everyday interactions where power is misused against those deemed out of place. True change requires both individual courage and collective action. William's stand became powerful because Commissioner Carter witnessed it, Sarah recorded it, Officer Martinez spoke up, and a community rallied around it. This reveals an important truth: systems resist change until enough people refuse to participate in their dysfunction. Justice isn't achieved through single victories but through sustained commitment to transforming both policies and relationships. The intergenerational aspect of William's story, working alongside his grandson Michael, reminds us that the struggle for equality passes through generations, with each bringing new tools and perspectives. Perhaps most powerfully, William's journey shows that even painful experiences can become catalysts for meaningful change when channeled into constructive action rather than bitterness. In our own communities, we all face choices between comfortable silence and necessary disruption when witnessing injustice. Has there been a moment in your life when you witnessed injustice and had to decide whether to speak up or remain silent? What factors influence your decision? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story might inspire others to find their voice. If William's dignity in the face of discrimination moved you, please hit that like button to help this important story reach more viewers. Have you ever been treated as suspicious simply for existing in a public space? Or have you caught yourself making assumptions about who belongs in certain places? Subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge us to examine these uncomfortable but necessary questions about equality and belonging in our communities. We'd be grateful if you'd share this video with someone who needs to understand how seemingly small incidents of bias can reveal larger patterns of injustice. Thank you for bearing witness to William's journey from victim to catalyst for change. May we all find the courage to stand for dignity when it matters most.